and plans to scrap criminal record checks for anyone working or volunteering with children will be published by the government today.
Yes, these changes are part of the Freedoms Bill, which also includes restrictions on the use of anti-terrorism powers, storing DNA samples and the use of CCTV.
Some campaigners, though, say the reforms will make it easier for adults in positions of trust to abuse children. In a moment, we're hoping to speak to Nick Clegg, but first let's talk to former detective and child protection expert Mark Williams-Thomas. Mark, can I just clarify, first of all, your credentials? This is your area of expertise, looking after children, children welfare.
Absolutely. I mean, I followed this right from the very beginning. I've been involved very much in liaising and speaking with those people who've drawn up the guidelines, talked about how this process would start. And don't forget, this was halted by the change of government. The new government came in and they said, let's stop it, let's look at a more common sense approach. This isn't about a common sense approach. This is about saving money.
Okay, well, let's just go through, take me through some practical examples and where you see the problems lie.
Yep.
Someone, for example, there was a lot of attention, authors made a big fuss about the idea of people going in to read in schools. Should they or should they not be checked? Now, take me through how this change might affect that and what you think the risks are.
So the system was going to be that if you were an author going into a school, you would be required to do a CRB check. Okay. They then changed that because actually what they looked to do is they looked to say, let's look at that as a different level of frequency. So if you went into a school once a month, you would have to be required to check. Then they changed that once a week. We don't know where this new level will be, but it's an intense level. So I would suspect it's may even be as much as every day. So if you were an author going into school every day, you would be required to do that. Now the chances are you won't be going in every day as an author, so therefore you wouldn't be required under the change to do a CRB. But this is what's really important, is at the time authors came out and said this is a disgrace, we shouldn't have to be doing CRB check. In 2004, William Main was convicted, he was an author, very well known author, was convicted of a considerable amount of indecent assaults against young children. The prosecution at the time felt that he'd abused in excess of 100 children. He was going into school, he was talking to children, he was reading with young girls, and the people that he abused, he had direct contact with and abused them as a result of going in and reading at school. So there's historical evidence here to say that actually that's not a justifiable argument to say they shouldn't be CRB checked.
Well, let's broaden this out then. The suggestion seems to be that there is a common sense approach that should work most of the time. That seems to be the gist of what we're saying now. You don't need the rigour of these checks for all people all the time. Now, do you think that is a recipe for things going wrong?
Well, it's creating an opportunity for offenders to see that, and whatever is put in place with regards to how much access, they will then change and say, well, I don't have that much access. So the understanding is if you are saying that I have to do a CRB check if I see a child every day, then what they will say, well, we don't see a child every day, I see them every other day. Particularly in the voluntary sector, this is where the massive area the problem is, because within the statutory sector, most of them will be doing CRB checks anyway. But within the voluntary sector, what we've seen, we know now more about offenders than we've ever known before. We know how devious they are, we know how calculated they are, we know how much they lie. So what they will do, they will see this as an opportunity and they will strike. They will gain access to children in order to offend against them.
Well, I mean, that portrait you're painting is quite a frightening one. The idea, it's like the bogeyman idea, that they are literally waiting for the opportunity to get into an environment, a volunteering environment, whatever. Is that realistic? Is that really what your experience has told you? And you really think that without these checks, that's going to get worse?
This is a massive backward step. We had the Bishard inquiry, which came after Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman murder, and the recommendations that came out of that was about creating a database in order that you should be checked and you should have some kind of license in order to work with children. After all, if you want to drive a car, if you want to fly a plane, if you want to go abroad, you have to have a passport. Why not when you work with children? And in fact, if you speak to the large majority of parents whose children are looked after by adults, none of them object to it. They'd say, I much prefer to know what the background of these people are. To pander to these people who have come out, the civil liberty group, and turned around and said it's not right. I tell you, at the end of the day, the most valuable person is that child. And if we can do everything we can to safeguard that, and people do CRB checks, and they do come back with convictions on them, and they stop people from working with children.
Okay, Mark, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Let's cross over to Westminster and speak to the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg. And a very good morning to you. Okay, so we have just been talking about these changes with former detective and child protection expert Mark Williams-Thomas. I mean, to put it briefly, he says this is a massive backwards step. Tell us what you're doing and why.
I don't agree with that, because at the moment, under the scheme proposed by Labour, over 9 million adults would be basically treated with suspicion for often just volunteering to help out, maybe driving their neighbours' children to a football club on a Saturday afternoon, or going into a school once a month, supervised by other teachers to read a book. And of course we need to have checks on those people who are working regularly with children, with vulnerable adults, but not with everybody who's volunteering, often on a very kind of irregular basis, simply trying to help out. We want to get get it into proportion.
What is the new level? You've said that somebody going into a school once a month won't need to be checked. What happens if you go into a school to read once a week?
Well, what we're doing is we're going to narrow the areas where you will need these criminal checks, and crucially, you won't need to have these criminal checks every time you do something different. So, once you've done it, then they can be updated automatically. So that means it'll be easier to administer, but also more proportional. We estimate, instead of basically casting a shadow of doubt over 9 million adults, it'll be about half that, just over 4 million. So it's still going to be a scheme of some considerable size, but one which doesn't cast that kind of atmosphere of distrust over adults who are simply trying to do their best by their own children, by children in their own community.
I'm sure many people will welcome that. But I'm just wondering, if you are a volunteer who goes into a school once a week and you're frustrated that you have that air of suspicion over you, are you freeing that person from these checks?
Well, I can't now, obviously, because we're working with many organisations and the police and others to set up the system in the coming months. I can't pick out one example now and tell you exactly whether it falls on one side of the borderline or the other. But
how do you know then how many people are going to be freed from having these checks?
The estimate is that we'll be able to reduce by around a half the millions of people who otherwise would be subject to the scheme. And as I said before, certainly someone just going in occasionally to read a book in school in the presence of other teachers would not be subject to the scheme in the way that they would have been before. You're asking me exactly about the timetable of the school, and that's something, of course, I can't help you with right now. But the basic principle that if you're volunteering to take your children and your neighbours' children to a football game at the weekend, or you're volunteering to go to the local school in the presence of other teachers, occasionally reading out a book, we don't think that's something where you should be subject to the full kind of battery of criminal checks.
The trouble, I'll tell you, it's an issue that's come up for a number of people, and Jenny, one of our viewers, articulates it this way. The system is in place now and puts parents' minds at ease, so why change it? There is almost a problem with having said that all of these people should be under suspicion. You're now asking parents to put back into place trust that they've already been told officially they shouldn't have. And that's a hard genie to put back into the bottle, isn't it?
Well, it's not quite like that, is it? Because actually the scheme, as proposed under Labour, isn't actually being enforced, but we actually stopped that some time ago.
But we were told there was a need for it.
Because we thought it was, far, over the top. No, we've always been very, very clear. I was very clear in opposition, very clear in government. What we need to do is get the balance right. The balance was got wrong under Labour.